There is something unusual about certain old buildings. Not unusual in a way that announces itself loudly. Not unusual in a way that most people notice when they walk past. But if you slow down, and if you look carefully at the lower levels of these structures, the parts that sit at or below the current ground level, you begin to notice something that quietly does not fit. Their doorways, arched openings, entrances that no longer lead anywhere. They are sealed shut, filled in with newer stonework or brick, or simply buried beneath layers of soil, pavement, and accumulated urban material. They sit there in silence, and most people never give them a second thought. What makes this worth paying attention to is not the existence of one or two such openings. Old buildings develop blocked doorways for many ordinary reasons. A wall is added. A renovation changes the layout. A door is no longer needed and is filled in. That kind of thing happens regularly and does not require much explanation. But this is something different. This is not isolated. This is not the result of a single building owner deciding to block an old entrance. This pattern appears in cities across different countries, across different continents, across entirely different architectural traditions. The same basic feature, a lower-level opening that no longer connects to the surface, appears with a frequency that begins to feel less like coincidence and more like something worth examining. The pattern repeats more often than most people realize. You find it in older European cities, where the streets are narrow and the buildings are centuries old. You find it in cities that were built up rapidly during the 18th and 19th centuries. You find it in places where the architectural record is well preserved and carefully studied. And you find it equally in places where much of the historical documentation is incomplete or missing. It crosses cultural and geographical lines in a way that makes it harder to dismiss as a purely regional phenomenon. Once you begin to look for it, the question stops being whether this exists and starts being why it exists so consistently. The first and most basic question is this: why would an entrance be buried? That question sounds simple, but it resists a simple answer. Entrances are not built by accident. They are deliberate features. They require planning, material, labor, and design. Someone decided where to place that opening, how tall to make it, how wide, how to finish the surrounding stonework. Entrances are built because they are meant to be used. They connect the inside of a structure to the outside world. They are one of the most fundamental elements of any building. So when an entrance disappears underground, when it is no longer accessible, no longer visible at surface level, no longer connected to the street, it raises a question that sits quietly without a fully satisfying answer. Consider the investment involved. These are not small gaps or narrow slits in a wall. Some of the buried openings found in older structures are substantial. They are arched doorways built with careful craftsmanship. The stonework around them is finished. The proportions are deliberate. In some cases, the detailing matches the upper levels of the same building, suggesting these lower entrances were treated with the same level of attention and care as the primary facade. Someone put significant effort into building these openings. That effort implies they were meant to serve a purpose for a long time, not to be buried shortly after construction. And yet buried they are. Some of these openings sit several feet below the modern street level, not a few inches, not a shallow gap that could result from a single repaving project. Several feet. In some locations, the buried entrances are only partially visible. The upper portion of an arch still peaks above the current pavement line, while everything below it has disappeared under the ground. In other cases, the openings have been completely covered and would be entirely invisible if not for careful observation of the building's proportions, or for accidental discovery during construction and renovation work. That last point is worth pausing on. A number of these buried lower levels have only come to attention because someone was digging for a different reason entirely. A utility line being installed, a foundation being reinforced, a basement being expanded, and then a wall is broken through, or a floor is excavated, and there's a room, or a corridor, or an arched doorway that was not on any plan, not referenced in any record, simply sitting there beneath the current surface of a city that had moved on without it. The discovery is usually treated as a curiosity, a footnote, something interesting but not particularly significant. And then the work continues, and the opening is often sealed again. What happened to the ground level? That is the question that sits at the center of this. If these entrances were built to be used, and if they were clearly designed to connect to an outdoor space, then at some point the outdoor space was at the same level as the entrance. That is simply how buildings work. A doorway is placed at a level that allows people to step through it comfortably from the outside. You do not build an entrance several feet above or below the surface you intend people to walk on. The entrance and the ground must have been at the same level at some point, which means the ground changed. Something caused the area around these buildings to sit at a different elevation than it once did. The standard explanation for this is urban accumulation. Cities, over long periods of time, gradually rise. Streets are repaved and the new surface sits slightly higher than the old one. Debris accumulates. Old structures collapse and new ones are built on top of the rubble. Drainage projects add fill material. Slowly, over decades and centuries, the ground level creeps upward. This process is documented and accepted in historical and archaeological research. It is not a theoretical idea. Rome is one of the most frequently cited examples. The modern city sits meters above the ancient one, and excavations reveal layer after layer of accumulated urban history. Istanbul shows similar patterns. Edinburgh's Old Town has well-documented histories of rising street levels, so the explanation exists. It is established. Most historians and architects who encounter these buried lower floors point directly to this process and consider the matter largely settled. At first, that seems like a reasonable conclusion. The ground rose. The entrances were buried. The buildings continued to be used from the higher level. That is the accepted version, and for many individual cases, it likely holds. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the explanation, while real and documented in specific well-studied locations, is applied very broadly, sometimes to situations where the supporting documentation is thin or absent. If a city's ground level rose significantly over a period of time, there should be some record of that process. Engineering decisions would have been made. Property records would reflect changes. Maps from different periods would show gradual shifts. In the well-documented cases, that evidence exists. But in a surprising number of locations where buried entrances appear, that level of documentation is not there. The rise in ground level is inferred from the physical evidence of the buried architecture itself, rather than confirmed through independent historical records. That is a subtle but important distinction. There is also the question of scale. Gradual urban accumulation over centuries can account for modest rises in street level, enough to partially bury a lower step or to cover the base of a wall. But several feet of elevation change in a relatively short period requires a much more substantial deposit of material. That kind of change is significant. It would have been noticed. It would have disrupted daily life. It would have required organized effort to manage. And yet, in some of the locations where the buried entrances sit deepest, there's no clear record of when or how that change occurred or what caused it. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because if the timing of the ground level change cannot be established with confidence, then neither can the explanation that depends on it. The accumulation story requires time. Slow, gradual, documented time. Where that time and that documentation are missing, the explanation becomes an assumption rather than a conclusion. And assumptions, however reasonable they may seem, are not the same thing as answers. Why does this pattern appear in so many different places at once? That is the part of the question that is hardest to set aside. Urban accumulation is a local process. It happens in specific cities due to specific local conditions, geology, drainage, population density, construction practices, historical events. It would not be expected to produce the same result across unconnected cities in different parts of the world at roughly the same depth and in roughly the same architectural conditions. And yet the pattern is widespread. The buried lower floors appear in cities that had no significant contact with each other. The depths are sometimes similar. The architectural character of the buried levels is sometimes comparable. That consistency invites a question that the local accumulation explanation does not fully answer. None of this means the standard explanation is wrong. It means the standard explanation may not be complete. There is a difference between a process that is real and documented in some contexts, and a process that fully accounts for every instance of a pattern across multiple continents and centuries. The first is certainly true. The second is less certain. And that gap between what is confirmed and what is assumed is exactly where the more interesting questions begin to emerge. What is clear is that these buried entrances are real. They exist. They can be observed, measured, and documented. They represent architecture that was built with purpose, and that now sits below the level of the world that surrounds it. Something changed between when they were built and now. Exactly what changed, how quickly, and whether the same forces were responsible in every location. Those questions do not yet have complete answers. The openings remain. Some are visible. Some are sealed. Some are still waiting to be found beneath streets and pavements that no one has had reason to disturb. They are a physical record of something that shifted in the ground, in the cities, in the history that we think we understand. And the more carefully you look at that record, the more clearly you can see that the story of what happened to these buried entrances has not yet been fully told. When people first encounter the idea of buried entrances in old buildings, the response from most historians and researchers is calm and straightforward. There is an explanation for this. It is not mysterious. It is not unexplained. It is simply the result of how cities work over long periods of time. The explanation is practical, logical, and widely accepted. And on the surface, it does answer the basic question. Cities grow. Ground levels rise. Entrances get buried. That is the short version, and for most people who study urban history, it is sufficient. The longer version begins with understanding what cities actually do over time. A city is not a fixed thing. It is a living system that constantly changes, repairs itself, expands, contracts, and rebuilds. Every generation that lives in a city leaves something behind, physically, materially, literally. Old paving stones are covered with new ones. A road that floods repeatedly gets raised slightly to improve drainage. A collapsed wall is cleared away, but the rubble is not always removed entirely. It gets compacted, built over, and eventually becomes part of the ground itself. A building burns down, and a new one rises on top of the old foundation. This happens once, then again, then again. Each cycle adds a small amount of material to the surface. Each addition raises the level slightly. Over enough time, the accumulation becomes significant. This process has a name. It is called urban accumulation, or sometimes stratigraphic buildup, and it is one of the foundational concepts in urban archaeology. It is not a theory in the uncertain sense of the word. It is an observed and documented phenomenon. Archaeologists working in ancient cities rely on it constantly. When they dig into the ground beneath a modern city, they find layers. Each layer corresponds to a different period. The deeper the layer, the older it is. The surface of the ancient city sits well below the surface of the modern one, and the difference in elevation represents centuries of accumulated material between them. This is not speculative. It is measurable and repeatable. The cities most often cited when this explanation is applied are Rome, Istanbul, and Edinburgh. Rome is perhaps the most striking example. The ancient city, the Rome of the Republic and the early empire, does not sit at the level of the modern street. It sits beneath it. In some parts of the city, the difference is several meters. When archaeologists excavate sites in Rome, they routinely pass through medieval layers, then early Christian layers, then late Roman layers, before reaching the period they are studying. The ground has risen that much, and the buildings of those ancient periods are still there, partially or fully underground, their lower floors buried beneath centuries of accumulated urban history. Walking through certain excavated sites in Rome, you descend staircases to reach what were once ground-level rooms. The architecture around you was not designed to be underground. It simply ended up there. Istanbul tells a similar story. The city has been continuously occupied for an extraordinary length of time, and that continuous occupation has left layer upon layer of material beneath the current surface. Structures from the Byzantine period are partially buried. Some are only visible because later construction exposed them accidentally. The Basilica Cistern, one of the city's most well-known underground structures, was essentially forgotten for centuries, not because it was hidden deliberately, but because the city grew around and above it, and the knowledge of what lay beneath gradually faded. That kind of erasure through accumulation is exactly what the standard explanation describes. connection to each other, across different continents and different building traditions, the detail becomes harder to set aside. Urban accumulation is a local process. It is driven by local conditions. It should produce local results. It should not, on its own, produce the same result in dozens of unconnected locations at comparable depths and in comparable architectural conditions. And yet that is what the pattern appears to show. None of this means the standard explanation is false. It means the standard explanation may be only part of the answer. It may account for many individual cases while leaving others unexplained. It may describe a real process that is being applied too broadly to cover cases where a different or additional explanation might be needed. That possibility is not often raised in mainstream discussions of this subject. The accumulation explanation is presented as complete, and the conversation moves on. But the questions that remain after the explanation has been given are still there. They sit quietly in the physical evidence of the buried entrances themselves, in the depth of burial that does not always match the gradual accumulation timeline, in the absence of documentation for certain cases, in the geographic spread of a pattern that a purely local process should not be able to produce. The explanation is the starting point of this investigation, not the end of it. And starting points, however well established, are only useful if they lead somewhere closer to a complete understanding. Whether the accumulation explanation can carry this investigation all the way to that understanding is a question that, at this stage, remains genuinely open. The accumulation explanation, as it has been presented, is logical and supported in certain well-documented cases. That has already been established. But accepting that a process is real in some locations is different from accepting that it fully explains every instance of a pattern that appears across many locations. And this is where the first serious problem begins to emerge. Not a problem that overturns the explanation entirely, but a problem that asks it to account for details it does not always address. The first of those details is documentation, or more precisely, the absence of it in places where it should exist. If streets rose gradually over time due to accumulation, through repaving, debris, construction waste, and drainage improvements, then that process would not have been invisible. It would have been experienced by the people living through it. A street that rises even a few inches over the course of a generation is a street that requires constant adjustment. Doorways need to be raised. Drainage needs to be rerouted. Steps need to be added or removed. Property boundaries shift slightly. These are not invisible changes. They are practical, daily life changes that would have generated records. Engineering decisions would have been made and noted. Municipal authorities would have issued instructions. Property owners would have filed complaints or requests. Merchants would have noted changes to their storefronts. Somewhere in the administrative and personal records of a city, the slow rise of its streets should leave a trail. In some cities, that trail exists. Rome, as discussed, has extensive archaeological and historical documentation of how its ground level changed over time. The process is traceable through excavation records, through historical accounts written by people who observed older structures partially buried in their own lifetimes, and through maps that show the city at different periods. Edinburgh has similar documentation for specific areas. These are cases where the accumulation story is not just inferred from the physical evidence of buried lower floors. It is confirmed by independent records that describe when and how the ground changed. Those cases are genuine. They are solid. They support the explanation directly. But those cases are not universal. And this is where it becomes unclear, because the accumulation explanation is routinely applied to cities and locations where that level of documentation does not exist. In these places, the rise in ground level is inferred entirely from the physical evidence itself, from the buried lower floors, the sealed entrances, the architectural details that sit below the current surface. There are no accompanying maps showing the transition. There are no engineering records describing the work. There are no historical accounts written by people who witnessed the change. The explanation is imported from better documented locations and applied here by assumption. That is not necessarily wrong. Scientific and historical reasoning regularly involves applying known principles to new cases where direct evidence is limited. But it does mean the explanation in those cases rests on a foundation that is thinner than it might appear. When a researcher says the buried entrances in a particular city are the result of urban accumulation, they may be correct. But if the only evidence for that conclusion is the buried entrances themselves, then the explanation is circular. The buried lower floor is evidence of rising ground level, and the rising ground level is used to explain the buried lower floor. That loop does not contain independent confirmation, and without independent confirmation, it remains an inference rather than a conclusion. This raises questions that are worth holding onto as the investigation continues, not because the accumulation explanation is wrong, but because the confidence with which it is applied does not always match the strength of the evidence behind it. And when you begin to look at the specific physical details more carefully, the gap between the explanation and the evidence becomes a little wider. The most direct problem is scale. Gradual urban accumulation, the kind produced by routine repaving, debris deposits, and incremental construction, adds material to a surface slowly. Archaeologists who study stratified urban sites generally describe accumulation rates that, while variable, tend to operate over long time frames. A meaningful rise in street level through ordinary accumulation is typically measured in centuries, not decades. It is a slow process by nature, and a slow process produces a modest result within any given human time frame. A street that accumulates material gradually over 300 years might rise by a foot or two. That is significant, but it is also measurable, trackable, and consistent with the idea of gradual change leaving gradual records. But some of the buried entrances in question do not sit 1 or 2 feet below the current surface. They sit several feet down. In certain documented cases, the depth of burial is substantial enough that ordinary gradual accumulation, even over several centuries, would struggle to account for it without additional explanation. A buried entrance sitting 5 or 6 feet below the modern street level implies that a very large amount of material was deposited around that building. That material had to come from somewhere. It had to arrive somehow. And if it arrived gradually, over a long period, the process should be traceable. If it arrived quickly, in a shorter period of time, then it was not gradual accumulation at all. It was something more significant, and that something has not been clearly identified in many of the locations where deep burial is observed. At first, this seems like a technical detail, a matter of volume and time scale. But there is a problem, because the depth of burial is not consistent, even within the same city. And that inconsistency is one of the more quietly interesting aspects of this pattern. Some researchers have noted that within a single city, sometimes within a relatively small geographic area, buildings with buried lower floors sit alongside buildings that show no such burial at all. On one block, a structure has a sealed lower entrance sitting several feet below the street. On the next block or nearby, a building of comparable age shows no buried lower level at all. Its ground floor aligns with the current street perfectly. If the rise in ground level was a gradual, citywide process driven by the general accumulation of material across the urban surface, this inconsistency is difficult to explain. Gradual citywide accumulation would be expected to affect a city somewhat uniformly. Different rates in different neighborhoods are possible. Areas with more construction activity, or areas prone to flooding, might accumulate material faster than quieter areas. But the variation observed in some cities is more localized than that. It appears block by block, or even building by building, rather than neighborhood by neighborhood. And that level of localization does not fit comfortably with the idea of a slow, general, citywide process as the primary cause. However, the timeline does not fully match in another respect as well. If accumulation happened gradually and uniformly, the architectural record of that process should look a certain way. Buildings that experienced rising ground levels over centuries would typically show evidence of adaptation. New entrances cut higher up in the facade, modifications to window heights, changes to drainage points, alterations to steps and thresholds. These adaptations would appear at different times across the building's history, reflecting the ongoing nature of the change. In some buildings, that kind of layered adaptation is visible, but in others, the transition from buried to active appears more abrupt. The lower level is simply sealed, without the gradual visible record of a building slowly adjusting to a rising street. That abruptness is not impossible to explain, but it adds another layer of uncertainty to the standard account. There is also the question of what the buried material actually consists of. In well-studied cases like Rome, excavations reveal identifiable layers: burned debris from specific fires, demolition material from known construction phases, flood deposits from documented inundation events. The layers tell a story, and that story can be cross-referenced with historical records. But in less well-studied locations, the composition of the material filling around buried lower floors has not always been analyzed in detail. It is simply described as fill, or earth, or accumulated sediment. Without knowing what that material is made of, it is difficult to determine how it got there. Different types of material point to different processes: deliberate dumping, natural flooding, gradual debris, or something else. The absence of that analysis in many cases means the nature of the burial itself remains an open question. That detail sounds minor at first, until you realize that it represents a significant gap in the evidentiary foundation of the standard explanation. If we do not know what the material around the buried entrance is made of, we do not fully know how it got there. And if we do not fully know how it got there, we cannot fully confirm that it arrived through the gradual accumulation process the explanation describes. This is not a fatal weakness in the explanation. It is simply an unexamined assumption embedded within it. But unexamined assumptions, particularly in cases where the physical evidence raises questions about scale and consistency, deserve more attention than they typically receive. The inconsistency in depth and distribution across cities is the detail that some researchers find hardest to move past. It is one thing for a citywide process to produce varying results in different neighborhoods. It is another for that process to produce dramatically different results on adjacent blocks with no clear explanation for why the variation exists. That kind of irregular pattern suggests the cause may not have been a single uniform process applied across an entire urban area. It suggests something more localized, or more variable, or potentially more than one distinct cause operating in different areas at different times. What those causes might be is not established, but the recognition that the pattern is irregular is itself significant. This inconsistency does not mean the official explanation is wrong. That point deserves to be stated clearly. Urban accumulation is real. It has occurred in documented cities and produced exactly the kind of buried lower floors that this investigation is examining. The explanation is not invented. It is not unsupported. In many individual cases, it is the correct explanation, and there is no reason to look further. But an explanation that works in some cases does not automatically work in all cases, and the specific details that begin to emerge when this pattern is examined closely: the missing documentation, the unexpected depth of burial, the inconsistent distribution within single cities, the unanalyzed composition of fill material, together suggest that the explanation may not apply equally everywhere it is used. Some of those locations may need a different account, or an additional one, or simply more honest acknowledgement that the record is incomplete and the conclusion is not yet fully supported. And that is a question worth sitting with, not as a dramatic challenge to established history, but as a genuine and reasonable observation that the evidence, in certain locations, does not yet match the confidence of the explanation being offered. The buried entrances are physical facts. What put them where they are is a question that, in more cases than is typically acknowledged, remains genuinely and carefully open. To move further into this investigation, it helps to stop and look more carefully at what these buried entrances actually are. Not in abstract terms, not as a general category, but as specific physical objects with specific physical characteristics. Because when you examine them closely, certain details emerge that do not sit comfortably within the standard explanation. And those details begin with something simple: the size and quality of what was buried. There's a common assumption that buried or underground architectural features are, by nature, lesser features, simpler, more utilitarian, built for function rather than appearance. A basement is a basement. A foundation is a foundation. These are parts of a building that are not meant to be seen, and so they are not treated with the same care as the parts that are. That assumption is reasonable when applied to most buildings. Foundations are rough. Basement walls are plain. Underground spaces are practical, not decorative. And if the buried lower floors of these old buildings matched that description, there would be very little to discuss. But that is not always what is found. Some of these buried entrances are not small. They are not rough or utilitarian in their construction. Some are quite large, arched doorways with careful stonework around them, proportioned in a way that suggests they were designed for regular, everyday use by people moving in and out of a building as part of normal life. The arches are finished. The surrounding masonry is worked with attention. The dimensions suggest these were primary access points, not secondary ones, not service entrances, not maintenance openings. They were built to be used by people as the main way in and out of a structure, and they were built to look that way. This is the detail that begins to complicate the picture, because if these entrances were always intended to be at or below ground level, if the plan from the beginning was for them to be in a basement or foundation position, then the investment in their construction is difficult to explain. Builders do not typically lavish careful stonework and finished arches on openings that are never going to be seen from the outside. The craftsmanship applied to an entrance reflects the importance of that entrance, and the level of craftsmanship found in many of these buried openings reflects something that was meant to face the world openly, not sit underground in permanent darkness. In several European cities, this becomes even more apparent when you look beyond just the entrances and consider entire lower floors. There are buildings where the floor below the current street level is not a simple storage area or a rough utility space. It is a full floor, with rooms, with corridors, with ceilings that are higher than you would expect for a space designed to be underground. The ceiling height alone is a telling detail. Underground spaces built intentionally as basements or cellars are generally given just enough height for practical use, enough to stand and move, but no more than necessary. Extra ceiling height in an underground space serves no purpose and costs additional material and labor. Builders do not add it without a reason, but the buried lower floors in many of these buildings have ceiling heights that match or come close to matching the upper floors of the same structure. That is not a design choice consistent with basement construction. That is a design choice consistent with a floor that was intended to function at the same level of importance and use as the floors above it. The height was given to these spaces because, at the time they were built, height was appropriate for them. They were not being designed as underground spaces. They were being designed as ground-level spaces, or close to it. The windows reinforced this observation. Where windows still exist in these buried lower floors, and in some cases they do, partially or fully visible, they are not the narrow, horizontal slits typical of basement windows. Basement windows are designed to capture whatever light can be taken from a narrow gap between the building and the ground. They are small because the space available for them is small, but the windows found in some of these buried levels are wider. They are positioned and proportioned as if they were intended to look out onto an open exterior space, a street, a courtyard, a public area, not to peer through a thin gap in the earth. That positioning only makes sense if, when those windows were designed and built, the exterior space was genuinely open. The windows were planned for a view that no longer exists from that level. This is where it becomes unclear, because if the windows were designed for an open exterior, and if the ceilings were given heights appropriate for habitable floors, and if the entrances were finished with the craftsmanship of primary access points, then all of these features point in the same direction. They point toward lower floors that were once fully functioning, fully visible, fully accessible parts of their buildings, not hidden, not underground, not designed for storage or utility, but designed for life and use at ground level. And now they are buried. Researchers in several fields have noted this specific detail, the design language of these buried levels. Design language is a useful concept here. It refers to the consistent visual and structural vocabulary that a builder uses throughout a structure. The choice of stone type, the way arches are formed, the ratio of wall thickness to opening width, the finishing applied to surfaces, the style of decorative elements where they appear. These choices tend to be consistent within a single building because they reflect the decisions of a single builder or a single period of construction. They form a kind of coherent grammar that runs through the entire structure. And in many of the buildings with buried lower floors, that grammar does not stop at the current street level. It continues downward. The stonework in the buried section matches the stonework above. The proportions are consistent. The decorative details, where present, follow the same style. The architectural vocabulary of the buried level is the same as the architectural vocabulary of the visible level. This consistency is significant. It suggests the buried portion and the visible portion were designed together, as parts of a single unified structure, not as different phases of construction with different purposes. At first, this seems like a straightforward observation. Of course, a building has consistent architecture throughout. But there's a problem. If the lower level was always intended to be a basement or a foundation, if it was planned from the beginning to sit underground, then the investment in matching its design language to the upper floors would be unusual. Builders throughout history have made clear distinctions between the finished portions of a structure and the utilitarian portions. The finished portions receive decorative attention. The utilitarian portions do not. The fact that these buried levels received the same decorative attention as the upper floors suggests they were not, at the time of construction, considered utilitarian portions. They were considered finished portions. They were meant to be seen. Some buildings reveal this distinction in a particularly direct way. There is a visible line, a horizontal boundary somewhere in the structure, above which everything continues in a normal, active, well-maintained condition, and below which the architecture becomes buried, sealed, and inaccessible. Above the line, the building functions as it always has. Below the line, the same quality of construction sits in a different condition entirely. Same materials, same style, same level of craft, but one portion is in use, and the other is underground. What that boundary represents is not entirely clear. It could simply mark the point at which the rising ground level eventually sealed the lower portion of the building. That is the accumulation explanation applied directly. The ground rose to that line, and everything below it was covered. But if that is the case, then the boundary should be visible not just in a few buildings, but consistently across structures of similar age in the same area. And the ground level rise it represents should be traceable in the historical record of that city. In some cases it is. In others, it is not. The line exists without a fully explained cause, and that gap in the explanation is what makes it worth examining. There is also a subtler point here that deserves attention. Buildings are generally constructed from the ground up. The foundation is laid first, then the lower floors, then the upper floors. This means the lower portions of a building are the oldest portions. If the lower floors of these structures show the same quality of construction as the upper floors, and if the design language is continuous throughout, it suggests the entire structure was built in a single coherent phase, or at least that the lower floors were considered integral to the main design from the beginning. They were not added later as an afterthought. They were not built with a different purpose in mind. They were part of the original vision for the structure. And if they were part of the original vision, built with the same care and to the same standard as the rest of the building, then they were built to be used in the same way as the rest of the building. That is a reasonable inference, and it leads naturally to a question that the accumulation explanation does not answer on its own. If these lower floors were originally designed for the same level of use as the upper floors, and if they were built at a time when they would have been at or near ground level, then what changed? What caused the ground to rise around them to the degree that these full, finished, carefully constructed floors are now buried? The accumulation explanation offers a process, but a process is not the same as a specific account of what happened in a specific place at a specific time. The question is not just how ground levels rise in general. The question is what happened in these particular locations, to these particular buildings, and when. And for many of the structures showing buried lower floors, with high-quality construction and consistent design language, that specific account has not been fully written. That question quietly opens into a larger one, because if the lower floors were built to the same standard as the upper floors, and if they were designed with the same intention of active use, then the buried lower floors are not just an architectural curiosity. They are a record of something that changed. Something that took fully functioning floors of well-constructed buildings and placed them below the surface of the world that continued above them. What that something was, and whether the same something was responsible in all the places where this pattern appears, is a question that the physical evidence raises clearly and the historical record has not yet answered completely. Among all the physical details that appear in these buried lower floors, two stand out as particularly difficult to reconcile with the standard explanation. They are not dramatic discoveries. They are not hidden in obscure locations or known only to a small number of specialists. They are visible features of the buildings themselves, present in the architecture, readable by anyone who looks carefully enough. But they have not received the level of attention they seem to deserve. The first of these details involves windows. The second involves drainage. And together, they raise questions that the accumulation explanation, on its own, does not comfortably answer. To understand why windows matter in this context, it helps to think about what a window is designed to do. A window is an opening in a wall that connects an interior space to the exterior environment. It allows light to enter. It allows air to move. It allows people inside to see out. These functions all depend on one basic condition. The exterior side of the window must be open. There must be space outside the window, real, open, unobstructed space, for light to come through, for air to circulate, and for a view to exist. A window facing a solid wall of earth is not functioning as a window. It is just a hole in a wall that leads nowhere useful. The design of a window, therefore, reflects an assumption about what the outside of that window will look like. And that assumption is built into every decision about the window size, position, and proportion. Basement windows are a specific category of window design, and they look a specific way because of the conditions they are designed for. The exterior of a basement window is typically a narrow gap, a small well dug into the ground next to the building, allowing a sliver of light and air to reach the window from above. Because that gap is narrow, basement windows tend to be narrow. They are horizontal rather than vertical. They are positioned as high as possible on the basement wall, right at the point where the wall meets the ground, to take advantage of whatever light is available from that shallow well above them. They are small because the conditions outside them are constrained. A larger window in that position would gain nothing, because there is no additional light or view available to take advantage of. Basement windows are designed for basement conditions, but this is where it becomes unclear, because the windows found in many of the buried lower floors in question do not look like basement windows. They do not have the narrow, horizontal proportions of windows designed for a shallow exterior well. They are taller. They are wider. Their proportions are vertical, or at least balanced, in the way that windows designed for open exterior spaces tend to be. They are positioned on the wall not at the very top, straining to catch light from a narrow gap above, but at a height and in a manner consistent with windows that were expected to look out onto a genuine exterior environment, a street, a courtyard, a public space with real depth and real light. The proportions of these windows are not accidental. Builders do not make windows larger than necessary without a reason. Every window opening requires cutting through a wall, framing the opening, and managing the structural load around it. It is not a trivial task. The size and placement of windows in a pre-modern building reflects deliberate decisions made by someone who understood the conditions those windows would face. If the builder who placed these windows knew they were going to be at or below ground level, they would not have given them the proportions of windows designed for an open exterior. There would have been no reason to. The extra width and height would serve no purpose if the outside of those windows was always going to be a wall of earth. The design of these windows implies that the builder expected something different outside them. Some researchers note that this is not a universal feature. Not every building with a buried lower floor shows this characteristic. There are buried lower levels where the windows are small and simple, consistent with basement design, and where the accumulation explanation fits the physical evidence without contradiction. That point is worth acknowledging. The window detail is not present everywhere. It is not a rule that applies to every case, but it is present in enough cases, across enough different locations, that it represents a pattern requiring explanation. And in the cases where it does appear, it complicates the narrative of slow accumulation in a way that is difficult to set aside. If these windows were always intended to be below ground level, their design is difficult to justify. A builder working on a basement would not spend additional effort on larger, more carefully proportioned windows that would immediately be covered by the rising ground or blocked by the earth outside them. That effort would serve no purpose from the moment construction was completed. It would be waste. And builders, particularly in periods when materials and labor were expensive and carefully managed, did not typically build in purposeless waste. When a feature appears in a building, it is usually there for a reason. The reason these windows were given the proportions they have is most logically connected to an expectation that the outside of those windows would be open and accessible. And that expectation only makes sense if, at the time of construction, the ground outside was expected to remain at or below the level of those windows. At first, that seems like a reasonable inference, until it is examined more closely. Because if the ground was expected to remain at that level, then something happened afterward that the builder did not anticipate. The ground rose. The windows were covered. The exterior space they were designed to face disappeared underground. And the question that follows from that is the same one that has been present throughout this investigation. When did that happen? How quickly? And what caused it? The window design suggests it was not anticipated, which in turn suggests it may not have been gradual. Gradual change is generally something people adapt to, and adaptation leaves traces in the architectural record. The absence of adaptation, the presence of windows designed for open conditions that were simply buried rather than modified, suggests the change may have been more abrupt than the gradual accumulation story implies. The drainage question follows a similar logic, and in some ways it is even more direct. Drainage systems and buildings are designed around a simple physical principle. Water flows downward. Every element of a drainage system is positioned to take advantage of gravity, directing water from where it accumulates to where it can safely exit the building. The placement of drains, channels, and outflow points reflects the builder's understanding of how water will move through and around the structure. And that understanding is based on a clear assumption about where the ground level is and where the exterior environment is, relative to the building's floors. In a basement or underground space, drainage works differently than it does at ground level. Water that enters a basement tends to collect at the lowest point and must be removed by pumping it upward or channeling it to a lower exit point in the foundation. The logic of underground drainage is essentially the opposite of surface drainage. Surface drainage allows water to flow outward and away from the building under its own weight. Underground drainage requires active management to move water against gravity, or at minimum requires careful engineering to find lower exit points. The systems look different. They work differently, and a builder designing drainage for an underground space would not use the same approach as a builder designing drainage for a ground-level space. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because some of the buildings with buried lower floors show original drainage systems that appear to have been designed for surface conditions, not underground ones. The placement of drains and channels in these lower levels suggests water was expected to flow outward, toward the exterior walls and out of the building at floor level, rather than downward into a collection point or upward through a pump system. That design only makes practical sense if the exterior of those drains was open ground, at roughly the same level as the floor inside, allowing water to exit freely. If those drains were always underground, surrounded by earth on all sides, they would not function as designed. Water flowing toward an exterior wall that is buried in earth has nowhere to go. The drainage system would have been non-functional from the moment the ground rose above it. However, the timeline does not fully match the standard explanation here either. If the ground rose gradually around these buildings over centuries, the builders or occupants during that period would have recognized that the drainage was becoming less effective. They would have adapted. New drainage solutions would have been introduced. The old system would have been modified or replaced. Evidence of those adaptations would be present in the building fabric. But in some cases, the original drainage system appears largely intact and unmodified, designed for surface conditions, and then simply left in place as the conditions changed around it. That lack of adaptation is unusual. It suggests either that the occupants did not have time to adapt, or that the change happened so quickly that adaptation was not practical, or that the space was abandoned and sealed before adaptation became necessary. None of these possibilities are confirmed. Each of them introduces a different set of questions. The possibility that the change was too quick for adaptation is the most difficult to reconcile with the gradual accumulation explanation. Gradual processes allow time for response. If there was no response, if the drainage was simply left in its original, now non-functional state, It raises the question of whether gradual accumulation is the right description for what happened in that particular location. Some believe these details, the window proportions and the drainage orientation, are simply the result of builders working from standard templates without fully adapting them to the specific conditions of each project. Others disagree, arguing that pre-modern builders were extremely practical and would not apply design elements that served no purpose in the conditions they were building for. The disagreement has not been resolved, and both positions have something to support them. What remains is the physical evidence itself. Windows sized and positioned for open exterior conditions. Drainage systems oriented for surface-level water flow. Both of these features present in floors that are now underground. Both of them consistent with the interpretation that those floors were not originally designed to be underground. And both of them sitting quietly in buildings that the standard explanation has largely moved past without fully accounting for these specific details. This is where the explanation starts to weaken, not collapse, not fail entirely, but weaken in specific, observable, measurable ways. The windows and the drainage are not abstract arguments. They are not interpretations that require theoretical assumptions to support them. They are physical features of physical buildings that can be examined directly, and when they are examined directly, they do not fully support the picture of spaces that were always intended to be underground. They support a different picture, one in which these spaces were once at the surface, functioning normally, and were then buried. How that burial happened, and how quickly, is where the explanation still has significant ground left to cover. Up to this point, the investigation has focused on specific physical details, the quality of construction in buried lower floors, the proportions of windows, the orientation of drainage systems. Each of those details, examined individually, raises questions about whether the standard accumulation explanation fully accounts for what is found in these buildings. But there is a larger observation that begins to emerge when you step back from the individual cases and look at the pattern as a whole. And that observation is geographic. The buried lower floors and sealed entrances are not confined to one region. They are not a European phenomenon, or a Mediterranean one, or a feature of any single architectural tradition. They appear across a much wider area than a purely local explanation would predict. This is the point at which the investigation shifts in character. When a pattern is local, it can be explained by local causes. A single city with buried lower floors can be explained by that city's specific history, its geology, its drainage challenges, its particular pattern of construction and reconstruction over time. That kind of explanation is entirely reasonable and does not require looking beyond the individual location to find the answer. But when the same basic pattern appears in cities that have no direct historical connection to each other, in regions with entirely different climates, building traditions, and administrative histories, the local explanation begins to stretch. It does not break immediately, but it requires more work to maintain. The geographic spread of this pattern is worth describing carefully, because it is easy to overstate and equally easy to understate. The claim is not that every city on every continent shows buried lower floors in every old building. That would be an exaggeration, and exaggeration is not useful here. The claim is more specific and more measured than that. In cities across North America, across Europe, across parts of the Middle East, and in certain locations in Asia, buildings of a particular age, generally structures associated with the 18th and 19th centuries, and in some cases older, show lower levels that appear to have been designed for surface use, but are now buried. The feature appears with enough regularity, across enough geographic distance, that describing it as purely local urban accumulation requires an explanation for why local processes in unconnected cities produced such similar results. That question does not have a simple answer. And it is partly because of this geographic breadth that independent researchers and historians who operate outside of mainstream academic institutions began to take notice of the pattern. Mainstream academic research tends to be organized around specific regions, specific periods, and specific disciplines. An archaeologist studying Roman urban development is not typically in regular conversation with the historian studying 19th century American cities. A researcher examining Ottoman-era construction in the Middle East is not typically comparing notes with someone studying traditional architecture in East Asia. The specialization that makes academic research deep also tends to make it narrow. The connections between patterns in different regions are not always visible from within any single specialization. Independent researchers, working without the constraints of disciplinary boundaries, are sometimes better positioned to notice cross-regional patterns. This is not an argument that their conclusions are correct. Independent research varies enormously in quality and rigor, and much of it does not meet the standards that would be required for academic acceptance. But the observation that a pattern exists across regions is a different kind of claim from an explanation of why that pattern exists. The observation can be made carefully and accurately even by someone whose proposed explanation for it is speculative or unsupported. And the observation itself, that buried lower floors with similar characteristics appear across geographically separated cities, is one that is worth examining on its own terms, separate from whatever explanation is offered for it. Not all of the independent researchers who have noted this pattern agree with each other. Their explanations vary significantly, and in some cases they contradict each other directly. Some propose large-scale environmental events. Others focus on deliberate concealment or reconstruction. Others argue for a fundamental misunderstanding of 19th century urban history. The disagreement among them does not strengthen any single alternative explanation, but it does reflect the fact that the standard explanation has not fully satisfied everyone who has examined the evidence carefully. When multiple people, working independently and reaching different conclusions, all find the standard explanation insufficient, that convergence of dissatisfaction, even without convergence on an alternative, is a signal worth paying attention to. Some of the independent researchers who have looked at this subject point specifically to the 19th century as a critical period. And this focus is not arbitrary. The 19th century was a period of enormous urban transformation across multiple continents. Cities that had existed for centuries were redesigned, rebuilt, and restructured on a scale that had rarely been attempted before. New infrastructure, sewers, gas lines, railways, water systems, was installed across urban areas that had never had anything like it. Streets were widened, regraded, and repaved. Entire neighborhoods were cleared and rebuilt. The pace and scale of urban change in the 19th century was, in many cities, unlike anything that had come before. And it is precisely this period that shows some of the most significant evidence of buried lower floors and sealed entrances. Chicago is the example that appears most frequently in these discussions, and for good reason. The story of Chicago's razing is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of deliberate urban regrading in history. In the mid-19th century, the city faced a serious and worsening drainage problem. The land on which Chicago was built was flat and low, and the existing street level did not allow adequate water flow for the sewage and drainage systems that a growing city required. The solution was remarkable in its ambition: raise the entire city. Streets were elevated. New sewer systems were installed beneath them, and the buildings, many of them substantial brick and stone structures, were physically lifted to match the new street level, using large numbers of jackscrews operated simultaneously by teams of workers. The lower floors of buildings that could not be lifted, or were not lifted in time, became buried as the street around them rose. This is not folklore. It is documented in engineering records, in newspaper accounts from the period, in photographs, and in the surviving physical evidence of the city itself. Visitors to certain parts of Chicago today can still find traces of this history. Lower-level spaces that reflect the original ground floor, now accessible only from below the current street level. The Chicago case demonstrates clearly that deliberate, large-scale urban regrading was technically possible in the 19th century, and that it did produce exactly the kind of buried lower floors that are being examined in this investigation. But this is where it becomes unclear, because Chicago's case is exceptional not just in what happened, but in how thoroughly it was recorded. The decision to raise the city was a public, civic, widely discussed undertaking. It was covered by newspapers. It was documented by engineers. It was visible to everyone who lived in or visited the city during the process. The record of what happened is extensive and detailed. It leaves no ambiguity about when the change occurred, why it occurred, and how it was carried out. The buried lower floors in Chicago have a clear, confirmed explanation, and that explanation is available to anyone who wants to examine it. The problem is that this level of documentation does not exist for every city where the same pattern appears. Some cities show the result: buildings with buried lower floors, sealed entrances, lower levels that appear to have been designed for surface use, without the accompanying paper trail that Chicago provides. There are no engineering records describing a decision to raise the street level. There are no newspaper accounts covering the transformation. There are no photographs showing the process in progress. The physical evidence is present, but the documentary evidence that would explain it is absent or incomplete. However, the timeline does not fully match in a more specific sense as well. In some of the cities where the pattern appears, without documentary support, the architectural characteristics of the buried lower floors suggest a period of construction that predates the major 19th century urban transformation projects. If the buildings were constructed significantly before the mid to late 1800s, and if the regrading that buried their lower floors is not documented, then the Chicago model, deliberate civic regrading in the 19th century, cannot be directly applied. It might still be the correct type of explanation, but it would need to involve a different event at a different time, and that event has not been identified. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the combination of pre-19th century construction and undocumented burial creates a gap that the Chicago example does not help to fill. Chicago's story works because the timeline is confirmed, the buildings existed, the regrading happened, the documentation exists. In cases where the building's age is unclear, or where the timing of the burial is not established, the Chicago analogy is suggestive, but not conclusive. It shows that this kind of thing can happen and can be documented. It does not show that it happened in a specific, undocumented location. The absence of documentation does not prove anything. That point should be stated clearly. The absence of records does not mean that no explanation exists, or that the standard explanation is wrong. Records are lost. Archives are destroyed. Administrative systems in earlier centuries were inconsistent and incomplete. A city might have undergone significant regrading, with very little written record surviving to the present day. That is entirely possible. Historical silence is not the same as historical impossibility, but it is worth noting, because the pattern that is being examined here spans a wide geographic area and appears in cities where the documentary record varies enormously. In some locations, the evidence is rich and the explanation is well supported. In others, the physical evidence stands largely alone, without the independent confirmation that would make the explanation confident rather than assumed. And the gap between those two categories of cases, the well-documented and the undocumented, is where the most important and least resolved questions in this investigation currently sit. The broader pattern raises a question that has not been fully answered. If buried lower floors appear across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, and if the explanation for each individual case is local urban accumulation or local regrading projects, then there should be a corresponding body of local documentation spread across all of those regions. Some of that documentation exists, but its distribution is uneven in ways that are not entirely explained by the natural loss of records over time. Some regions show the physical pattern clearly, but the documentary pattern only partially. And that unevenness is itself a detail that this investigation cannot yet fully account for. There is an observation that keeps appearing in discussions of this subject, raised by different researchers working in different locations, often independently of one another. It is not an observation about a single building or a single city. It is an observation about the pattern itself, specifically, about how consistent that pattern is across places that should, by most historical accounts, have developed their architecture quite separately. And the more carefully this consistency is examined, the harder it becomes to explain it away with a simple reference to shared building traditions. The observation is this: when researchers look at the buried lower levels of buildings in different countries, not just in the same city, not just in the same region, but across genuinely separated locations, they find recurring design features that appear with a regularity that some find difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or to the ordinary spread of architectural influence. The features themselves are specific enough to be meaningful. Arched lower windows of a particular proportion, thick stone walls constructed with a particular method, wide doorways framed with deliberate care, sized and finished in a way that reflects considered design rather than functional minimalism. These elements appear not just once or twice, but repeatedly, in buried levels across different countries and different building traditions. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what architectural consistency normally means and where it normally comes from. Buildings in different places look similar for identifiable reasons. A colonial power spreads its architectural preferences to the territories it controls. A religious institution builds in a consistent style across all the regions where it operates. A widely read architectural manual from one country influences builders in another. A prominent architect trains students who then work in different cities and carry their teachers' methods with them. These are the documented mechanisms through which architectural styles travel across geography. They are real, well-studied, and responsible for a great deal of the architectural similarity we find across historically connected cultures. The standard explanation for the design consistency in buried lower floors draws on exactly this kind of reasoning. Architecture travels. It always has. The arched window, the thick stone wall, the wide-proportioned doorway. These are not exotic features unique to one tradition. They appear in many building cultures because the underlying logic of masonry construction tends to produce similar solutions to similar problems. An arch distributes load efficiently, and builders working independently in different places can arrive at the arch through the same practical reasoning. Thick walls provide stability and insulation, and that benefit is recognized across cultures. Wide doorways serve practical purposes that any builder would recognize. The argument is that these features are common because they are practical, and practical solutions tend to converge regardless of cultural origin. That is a reasonable argument. It deserves to be taken seriously. Architecture does travel, and independent convergence on similar solutions is a real phenomenon in the history of building. There is nothing inherently suspicious about finding similar features in buildings from different parts of the world. Similarity, on its own, does not require an unusual explanation. This point is made clearly and consistently by researchers who support the standard account, and they are not wrong to make it. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the argument about shared architectural traditions and independent convergence addresses the similarity of the features themselves. It does not fully address the similarity of the conditions in which those features are found. The buried nature of these levels is not just a backdrop to the architectural details. It is part of the pattern. The question is not only why buildings in different countries have arched windows and thick stone walls. The question is why buildings in different countries have arched windows and thick stone walls in lower levels that are now buried, sealed, and inaccessible. The burial is as much a part of the pattern as the design features themselves. And the standard argument about architectural diffusion does not account for why the burial would be so consistent across locations where the historical causes of burial are supposed to have been entirely independent. Think about what the standard explanation requires in this context. It requires that in city after city, across different continents and different centuries, local processes of urban accumulation or deliberate regrading independently produced buried lower floors with similar architectural characteristics, in similar conditions of burial, without any common cause connecting them. Each city's ground level rose for its own local reasons. Each set of buried lower floors reflects that city's specific history. The similarity in the buried architecture is explained by shared building traditions that spread through documented channels of cultural exchange. All of this happened independently, city by city, and the result happens to look consistent across locations. That explanation is possible. It cannot be ruled out, but it requires accepting a significant number of independent coincidences operating simultaneously. And the more locations are added to the list, the more cities across more continents show the same buried lower floors with the same recurring design features, the more those coincidences accumulate. At some point, the accumulation of coincidences begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern that deserves a unified explanation. That threshold is different for different researchers, and not everyone places it in the same location. But it is a genuine question about the limits of the independent causes explanation. One researcher who examined this subject described the consistency in a way that has been quoted in several subsequent discussions. The description involved the image of finding the same sentence written in different handwriting across documents that were supposedly produced independently. The content matches, the specific details align, but the handwriting, the local characteristics, the individual variations, is different. What this image captures is the tension between similarity of content and independence of origin. If the documents were truly independent, you would expect the content to diverge more than it does. The convergence of content, combined with the divergence of handwriting, creates a puzzle that neither the coincidence explanation nor the shared tradition explanation fully resolves. That image is useful precisely because it does not claim too much. It does not say the similarity proves a common origin or a single cause. It says the similarity is notable enough to deserve examination. It says the consistency feels slightly too precise for pure coincidence, without claiming certainty about what that precision means. That is a measured and careful observation, and it reflects the state of the evidence well. The pattern is real. The explanation for it is not settled. Others strongly disagree with this framing. Researchers who support the standard account point to the extensive and well-documented history of architectural exchange between cultures, particularly from the medieval period onward. The spread of Roman building techniques across Europe and the Mediterranean left a legacy of arched construction that persisted for centuries. Islamic architectural influences traveled along trade routes into regions far from their origin. European colonial expansion carried specific building styles to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The exchange of architectural knowledge through printed manuals, through the movement of trained builders, and through direct imitation of prestigious structures was continuous and far-reaching. By the time the 19th century arrived, certain building features had been so widely diffused that finding them in geographically separated locations required no special explanation beyond the well-documented history of cultural exchange. This counterargument is genuinely strong. The history of architectural diffusion is one of the best documented aspects of cultural history. It is supported by detailed records of specific influences, specific transmissions, and specific adoptions. Dismissing it would require much stronger evidence than the observation of design similarity alone. And the researchers who make this counterargument are right to insist that similarity cannot, by itself, demonstrate anything more than the ordinary operation of cultural transmission. However, the timeline does not fully match in one specific respect. The architectural diffusion argument works well when the buildings being compared were constructed within a period of active cultural exchange. If two cities were both part of the same colonial network, or both influenced by the same dominant building tradition, then similar architecture in both cities is expected and explained. But some of the locations showing buried lower floors with consistent design features are not easily connected by direct lines of cultural exchange during the period when the relevant buildings were constructed. The influence would need to have traveled through several intermediary steps, at a time when the pace of cultural transmission was slower than it became later. Whether that transmission is sufficient to explain the degree of consistency observed is a question that the diffusion argument does not always address directly. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the question is not just about whether architectural features could have traveled between two locations. It is about whether those features traveled with enough fidelity and arrived in enough similar conditions to produce the level of consistency that is actually observed. Cultural transmission produces variation as well as similarity. Styles adapt as they travel. Features are modified to suit local materials, local climates, and local preferences. Pure transmission rarely produces exact replication, and yet the buried lower floors in different locations show a consistency that goes beyond the typical variation expected from cultural diffusion over long distances and across cultural boundaries. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely alongside the burial condition itself, because the consistency is not just in the features of the architecture. It is in the fact that those features are buried. The cultural diffusion argument explains why buildings in different countries might have similar arched windows and thick walls. It does not explain why those similar features ended up in a similar condition of burial across locations, where the historical causes of burial are supposed to have been entirely different. Two things are consistent across locations: the design features, and the burial. A complete explanation needs to account for both consistencies, not just one of them. The disagreement between those who find the consistency significant and those who attribute it entirely to shared traditions has not been resolved. It is not a disagreement that can be resolved by examining one building or one city more carefully. It is a disagreement about how to interpret a broad pattern, and broad patterns require broad evidence to settle. The evidence available at this stage is suggestive in multiple directions simultaneously. It supports the shared tradition argument in some respects and complicates it in others. What remains is the observation itself, sitting in the record without a fully satisfying resolution. The same recurring features, the same general condition of burial, appearing across separated locations with a consistency that researchers continue to note and continue to debate. The explanation for that consistency is still being worked out, and the working out at this stage has produced more questions than it has settled. At a certain point in any investigation, the researcher stops relying only on the physical evidence of the buildings themselves and begins looking at the documentary record. The buildings tell part of the story, but documents, records, directories, maps, and images can sometimes tell a different part. They can establish timelines. They can confirm or contradict what the physical evidence suggests. They can show what a place looked like at a specific moment in history, before changes occurred that made it look different. And when researchers studying buried lower floors begin to look carefully at the documentary record from the mid to late 19th century, something appears that is quiet, specific, and not easily dismissed. The documentary record from this period is richer than from almost any earlier time. The mid-19th century saw the widespread adoption of photography, the expansion of municipal record-keeping, the growth of city directories as commercial and administrative tools, and the increasing use of maps for both civic planning and private property management. For the first time in history, it became possible to document what a city looked like in considerable detail, not just through written description, but through direct visual representation. Photographs captured street scenes, building facades, and public spaces with a specificity that no written account could match. City directories listed properties, businesses, and residents floor by floor. Property records tracked ownership and use over time. This was a period of unprecedented documentary density, and that density is precisely what makes the anomalies within it worth examining. What researchers begin to find, when they look through this material carefully, is a category of observation that appears across multiple cities and has been noted by multiple independent observers. It involves buildings that still exist today, buildings that currently show buried lower floors or sealed lower entrances, and how those same buildings appear in early photographs and records from the 19th century. In some of these images and documents, the buildings look different from how they look now. Not different in terms of style or general structure, different in a more specific and more puzzling way. The street level visible in the early photograph does not match what is now the ground floor of the building. In the photograph, the street appears to align with what is currently the first or second floor of the structure. Below that level, in the current building, there's more building. There are floors, or partial floors, or architectural elements that extend below what the photograph shows as ground level. But in the photograph itself, that lower section is simply absent from view. The building in the image appears to begin at a higher point than it actually does in physical reality today. Or alternatively, what is now a buried lower floor appears in the photograph to be at street level, open, visible, and in use. This observation, taken in isolation, might not seem significant. Photographs from the mid-19th century were taken under conditions very different from modern photography. The equipment was large and cumbersome. Exposure times were long. Photographers often worked from fixed positions that limited their angle of view. Wide-angle distortion was common and poorly controlled. Buildings could appear taller or shorter than they actually were depending on the distance and angle of the shot. And perhaps most importantly, early photographs are frequently misdated. An image assumed to show a city in 1860 might actually date from 1880 or 1890, a gap of decades during which significant changes could have occurred. These are all legitimate technical limitations, and historians who work with early photography are well aware of them. The standard response from historians when this observation is raised is to point directly to these limitations. The angle was misleading. The image was misdated. The perspective distortion made the street level appear different from what it actually was. The lower portion of the building was simply outside the frame, or obscured by activity in the foreground, or cut off by the compositional choices of the photographer. These are all reasonable explanations for any individual case. A single photograph showing an apparent discrepancy between the depicted street level and the current building profile can almost always be explained by one or more of these technical factors. That is a fair and grounded response, and it should not be dismissed. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the observation is not limited to a single photograph or a single city. It has been made independently by researchers looking at different images in different locations. The same basic discrepancy, a building currently showing a buried lower floor appearing in an early photograph without that lower section visible, or with that section at apparent ground level, appears in the photographic record of multiple cities. When a single observation can be explained by technical limitations, the explanation is satisfying. When the same observation appears repeatedly, across different images, different cities, and different researchers, the technical explanation requires a more careful assessment. It needs to account not just for individual errors, but for why the same type of error would appear so consistently in the same direction across so many independent cases. That question has not been fully addressed in mainstream discussions of this subject. The standard response, technical limitations, misdating, perspective distortion, is offered and then the conversation moves on. The frequency of the observation across locations is not typically engaged with directly. It is treated as a collection of individual errors rather than as a pattern that might itself require explanation, and that treatment leaves something unresolved. City directories and property records add another layer to this part of the investigation. These documents are less visually immediate than photographs, but they can be more precise about specific details. A city directory from the 1860s might list the businesses or residents occupying a building floor by floor. A property record might describe the dimensions and use of each level of a structure. If a building currently has a lower floor that is buried and inaccessible, but a directory from several decades earlier lists that floor as an occupied commercial or residential space, that would be a significant piece of information. It would establish that the lower floor was in use above ground at a specific, documented point in time, and that it became buried at some point afterward. Some researchers claim to have found exactly this kind of entry in historical directories, references to lower floor occupancies in buildings that now show those floors as buried. The claim is that the record of active use predates the burial, and that the burial therefore occurred within a documentable historical window. If this were confirmed systematically, it would be a meaningful contribution to understanding when the changes in ground level occurred and how quickly. But the documentation of these directory findings has not been presented in a comprehensive, verifiable form that would satisfy rigorous historical standards. The observations exist in scattered discussions and informal research rather than in published, peer-reviewed analysis. That gap between the observation and the rigorous documentation of it is itself a problem that the investigation has not yet resolved. However, the timeline does not fully match in another respect that is worth noting here. If the buried lower floors became buried during the mid to late 19th century, which is what the combination of photographic evidence and directory records would suggest, if taken at face value, then the burial event falls within a period of relatively dense documentation. A significant change in ground level affecting multiple buildings in a city during this period should appear somewhere in the administrative record. Engineering approvals, municipal decisions, property value adjustments, legal disputes about access or ownership. The practical consequences of burying the lower floors of occupied buildings would have generated paperwork. Some of that paperwork should have survived. And yet, in many of the cities where this photographic anomaly appears, that administrative paper trail is thin or absent. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely alongside the photographic evidence. Because the photographs, if their apparent implications are taken seriously, suggest a change that occurred within a documentable period, and the administrative record, which should reflect a change of that scale during that period, does not consistently confirm it. The two bodies of evidence, the visual record and the administrative record, do not fully align. They do not directly contradict each other, because the absence of administrative records is not the same as evidence that nothing happened. But the misalignment is present and has not been explained. There is a further layer to this part of the investigation that involves not just what the photographs show, but what they do not show. In some cases, researchers have pointed out that the transition between the current building profile and the buried section is not visible in early photographs, even when it should be. If a building had a lower floor at or near ground level during the period when a photograph was taken, and if that floor was constructed with the same architectural detail as the upper floors, then some evidence of it should appear in the image, even if the floor itself is partially obscured. A roofline that sits too low for the current building profile, a window arrangement that does not match the spacing of the upper floors, architectural proportions that suggest more building exists below the frame. In some photographs, researchers claim these signals are absent. The building appears complete as shown, without any visible suggestion of additional structure below. This is a subtle and technically demanding observation to make, and it requires careful photographic analysis rather than casual inspection. The claim is not universally made or universally accepted. Some researchers who have examined the same images find different things. The interpretation of early photographs is genuinely difficult, and different analysts working in good faith can reach different conclusions from the same visual material. That variability in interpretation is itself part of why this body of evidence remains inconclusive. What does not confirm anything? What it does not disprove the official explanation. Those statements are accurate and important. The photographic and documentary evidence examined in this part of the investigation does not establish a clear alternative to the standard accumulation account. It does not prove that the buried lower floors appeared suddenly, or that they were deliberately concealed, or that the historical record has been systematically altered. None of those conclusions follow from the evidence as it currently stands. What the evidence does do is add another layer to a picture that already has several unexplained edges. The physical details of the buildings, the window proportions, the drainage orientation, the quality of buried construction, raised questions that the standard explanation did not fully answer. The geographic spread of the pattern raised questions about whether local causes can account for a global consistency. The design consistency across locations raised questions about the limits of the architectural diffusion argument. And now the photographic and documentary record raises questions about timing and about whether the visual evidence of the 19th century aligns with the explanation that has been applied to it. Each of these edges, taken individually, can be addressed. Each individual question has a response that is reasonable and not obviously wrong. But the edges keep appearing. They appear in the physical evidence, in the geographic pattern, in the design consistency, and now in the documentary record. And the more of them accumulate, the harder it becomes to explain each one separately, in isolation, without considering whether they might be connected to each other in ways that a single, unified explanation would need to address. That possibility has not yet been examined with the depth and rigor it may deserve. And in the space between what has been examined and what is not, the investigation continues. Any investigation that accumulates enough unresolved questions eventually arrives at the same place. It arrives at the point where different people, looking at the same evidence, begin to offer different explanations. That is not a failure of the investigation. It is a natural consequence of evidence that is genuinely ambiguous, evidence that does not point cleanly in a single direction, that supports more than one interpretation, and that leaves enough space for reasonable disagreement to exist. The buried lower floors and sealed entrances that have been examined throughout this investigation have reached exactly that point. The questions are visible. The standard explanation has been found wanting in specific, identifiable ways. And now the range of interpretations being offered in response to those questions needs to be examined carefully and honestly. That range is wide. It spans from positions that are fully supported by mainstream academic research to positions that exist entirely outside it. And understanding where each position sits, what evidence supports it, and where its limitations lie is essential for anyone trying to think clearly about what this pattern of buried architecture actually represents. The spectrum of interpretations is not a sign that the subject is beyond understanding. It is a sign that the understanding is incomplete, and that the incompleteness has created space for multiple competing explanations to occupy simultaneously. At one end of the spectrum sits the position held by the majority of mainstream historians, architects, and urban archaeologists. Their interpretation is, in summary, that the buried lower floors are the result of ordinary urban processes operating over ordinary historical timescales. Cities accumulate material. Streets rise. Buildings that were once at ground level find their lower floors gradually buried as the ground around them slowly climbs. This process is documented in well-studied cities. It is consistent with the known behavior of urban environments over long periods, and it does not require any unusual event, any dramatic intervention, or any departure from the normal course of history to explain it. The explanation is mundane, and deliberately so. Mundane explanations, when they are supported by evidence, are generally preferable to dramatic ones. This position is not simply an assumption or a default. It is grounded in real research, real excavation, and real documentation in specific locations. The researchers who hold it are not ignoring the evidence of buried lower floors. They are explaining it through a mechanism that is well established and repeatedly confirmed. Their position deserves to be treated with the seriousness that its evidentiary foundation warrants. And for a significant portion of the cases where buried lower floors are found, the mainstream explanation is almost certainly correct. The accumulation process is real. It produces real results. Many of the buried lower floors that have been observed around the world are very likely the product of exactly the slow, gradual, local process that mainstream researchers describe. But there's a problem, and it is the same problem that has been present throughout this investigation. The mainstream explanation works well in the cases where the documentary record is rich and the physical evidence aligns with the proposed mechanism. In those cases, it is not just a reasonable explanation, it is a confirmed one. The issue arises when the same explanation is extended to cases where the documentary record is thin, where the physical evidence raises specific questions, and where the proposed mechanism does not fully account for the details observed. In those cases, the explanation is applied by analogy rather than by direct evidence. It is assumed to be correct because it is correct in similar-looking cases, not because it has been independently confirmed in the specific case at hand. That distinction matters, even if it is not always clearly acknowledged. At the other end of the spectrum, the interpretations become significantly more dramatic. Some independent researchers and alternative historians, looking at the same pattern of buried lower floors, propose explanations that depart sharply from the mainstream account. The most common of these alternative proposals involves a large-scale event, something that happened relatively quickly and affected ground levels across a wide area in a short period of time. The specific nature of that event varies, depending on who is proposing it. Some suggest a catastrophic flood of unusual scale, capable of depositing large amounts of sediment across urban areas rapidly. Others point to a large-scale destruction event, a war, a fire, or some other catastrophe, followed by rapid rebuilding on top of the debris, which would have raised ground levels significantly in a compressed time frame. A smaller group goes further still, arguing that some of the structures showing buried lower floors predate the civilizations that are conventionally credited with building them, and that the burial represents not the gradual change of a living city, but the covering over of an earlier, unknown urban layer. These alternative proposals share a common characteristic. They attempt to account for the aspects of the pattern that the mainstream explanation handles less well: the unexpected depth of burial, the absence of documentary evidence in certain locations, the geographic spread of the pattern, and the architectural consistency across separated cities. By proposing a large-scale event rather than a local process, they offer an explanation that could in principle produce consistent results across multiple locations simultaneously. If a single event, or a category of similar events, affected multiple cities during the same general period, it could explain why similar burial conditions appear in cities that had no direct historical connection to each other. This reasoning is not without logic. The questions it attempts to answer are real questions. The gaps in the mainstream explanation that it is responding to are genuine gaps. But the alternative proposals face a fundamental problem that prevents them from being taken seriously in mainstream academic settings, and that problem is evidence. A large-scale event of the kind proposed, something affecting ground levels across multiple continents in a relatively short period, would need to leave traces, geological traces, sedimentary traces, traces in the historical and oral record of the civilizations that experienced it. For some of the proposed events, those traces have not been found in the locations and at the scales that the theory would require. For others, the evidence offered is selective, inconsistently interpreted, or drawn from sources that do not meet the standards of rigorous historical or geological research. The alternative proposals identify real questions, but do not yet provide answers that satisfy the evidential requirements that any serious historical explanation must meet. The proposal that some buried structures predate the civilizations credited with building them faces an additional and more specific challenge. Construction techniques, material composition, and stylistic features of buildings can be analyzed in ways that help establish their age and origin. In cases where this analysis has been applied to structures with buried lower floors, the results have generally been consistent with the conventional dating. The structures appear to belong to the periods and cultures to which they are attributed. The claim of unknown prior civilizations building these structures requires overcoming a substantial body of physical evidence that points in a different direction. That does not make the claim impossible, but it makes it very difficult to sustain against the existing evidence. None of these alternative theories have achieved acceptance in mainstream research. That fact should be stated clearly, without using it to close the investigation prematurely. Academic acceptance is not the only measure of an idea's validity, but it is an important indicator of whether an idea has been subjected to rigorous scrutiny and survived it. The alternative proposals in this case have generally not survived that scrutiny, or have not been submitted to it in a form that allows rigorous evaluation. They remain outside the mainstream not because of institutional bias or a failure of imagination, but because the evidence they offer is insufficient to support the weight of the claims being made. But somewhere between these two positions, between the mundane certainty of the mainstream account and the dramatic speculation of the alternative proposals, there is a third category of response that is worth examining on its own terms. It belongs to researchers who do not commit to either extreme. They do not accept the mainstream explanation as complete and fully satisfying. They have looked at the specific inconsistencies, the missing documentation, the unexpected burial depths, the window proportions, the drainage orientations, the geographic spread, the design consistency, and found them genuinely unexplained by the accumulation account. But they also do not reach for dramatic alternative theories to fill the gaps. They simply ask questions. This position is less visible than the other two because it does not produce strong, quotable claims in either direction. It does not assert confident explanations. It does not argue for unknown civilizations or catastrophic floods. It points, carefully and specifically, at the places where the evidence is incomplete and the explanation is assumed rather than confirmed. It notes that the documentary record has gaps that have not been adequately explained. It observes that the physical features of certain buried levels are not fully consistent with the design choices expected for spaces intended to be underground. It asks why the pattern of burial is irregular within individual cities, affecting some blocks and not others, in ways that a uniform citywide process would not predict. These questions have not been answered in a way that fully satisfies everyone who asks them. That is not a dramatic statement. It is simply an accurate description of the current state of the investigation. The researchers asking these questions are not claiming that the mainstream explanation is wrong. They are claiming that it is incomplete. And incompleteness is not the same as error, but it is also not the same as resolution. An explanation that accounts for most of the evidence, but not all of it, is a partial explanation, and partial explanations leave legitimate room for continued inquiry. The space between the question and the complete answer is where this subject continues to sit. That space is not comfortable for those who prefer clean conclusions. It does not offer the satisfaction of a solved mystery or the excitement of a dramatic revelation. It offers something less immediately rewarding, but ultimately more honest. The recognition that the available evidence supports a partial explanation, that the partial explanation has identifiable limits, and that those limits have not yet been addressed with the depth and rigor they deserve. Some believe the gaps will eventually be closed by more thorough archival research and more systematic physical analysis of the buried structures themselves. Others disagree, arguing that the gaps reflect genuine limitations in what the historical record can now recover, and that a complete explanation may not be possible given what has survived. That disagreement has not been resolved either, and in the meantime, the buried lower floors remain where they have always been, below the current surface of cities that have continued to grow and change above them, holding whatever information they contain in patient, silent, physical form, waiting for questions careful enough to extract it. At the end of any investigation, there is a moment when the accumulated evidence must be looked at honestly, not to force a conclusion, but to assess clearly what has been established, what has not, and what remains genuinely uncertain. That kind of honest assessment is more difficult than it sounds. There is always a pressure, in any extended inquiry, to resolve the tension that the evidence has created, to land somewhere definite, to produce a conclusion that matches the effort of the investigation. But honest inquiry does not always produce clean conclusions. Sometimes it produces a clearer understanding of where the uncertainty lies, and that in itself is a meaningful result. So where does this investigation actually leave things? That question deserves a careful answer, not a rushed one. The starting point was simple and observable. Buried entrances exist in old buildings in cities around the world. That observation was not speculative. It was not the product of selective attention or motivated reasoning. The buried lower floors are physical objects. They can be visited, measured, photographed, and examined by anyone with access to the buildings. They are not hidden discoveries, known only to a small group of researchers. They are present in cities that millions of people move through every day, largely unnoticed because they have become part of the background of urban environment. The investigation began with the decision to notice them and to take seriously the questions their presence raises. Those questions were pursued through several distinct lines of evidence. The physical characteristics of the buried levels themselves, the quality of construction, the ceiling heights, the window proportions, the drainage orientations, were examined and found to be inconsistent in specific and identifiable ways, with spaces designed from the beginning to be underground. The geographic distribution of the pattern was considered and found to be wider than a purely local explanation would predict. The consistency of design features across geographically separated locations was examined and found to create tension between the architectural diffusion argument and the observed degree of similarity. The documentary record from the 19th century was looked at and found to contain photographic and administrative anomalies that have not been fully explained. And the range of interpretations offered by different researchers was mapped, from the mainstream account to the alternative proposals, with attention to what each position can and cannot support with available evidence. The mainstream explanation of urban accumulation is real. That point was established early and has not been weakened by the investigation. Cities do accumulate material over time. Ground levels do rise. Buildings that were once accessed at street level do find their lower floors gradually buried as the urban surface around them climbs. This process is confirmed by excavation, by historical documentation, and by the direct physical evidence of multiple well-studied cities. It is not a theory in the uncertain sense. It is an observed phenomenon with a clear mechanism, and for a significant number of the cases where buried lower floors are found, this explanation is almost certainly the correct one. The accumulation account is not wrong. It is real, it is supported, and it covers a genuine portion of the pattern being examined. That is not in dispute. What remains unclear is something more specific and more carefully bounded than a general challenge to the accumulation explanation. What remains unclear is whether that explanation covers every case, in every city, at the scale and in the conditions that are actually observed. And that is a different question from whether the explanation is real. A process can be real and well documented in some contexts while being insufficient or inapplicable in others. The question here is not whether urban accumulation happens. The question is whether it fully accounts for every instance of a pattern that includes features, depth of burial, absence of documentation, window proportions, drainage orientation, geographic consistency, that the accumulation mechanism does not always straightforwardly explain. When that question is asked carefully, the honest answer is that it remains open, not dramatically open, in the way that unsolved mysteries are sometimes presented, but genuinely open, in the way that incomplete explanations always are. The accumulation account handles the general category of the phenomenon well. It handles the specific details less consistently, and the gap between general coverage and specific consistency is where the unresolved questions live. The architectural details of the buried levels deserve particular attention in this summary. Throughout the investigation, specific features appeared repeatedly as points of tension with the standard explanation. The ceiling heights of buried lower floors were found to be inconsistent with basement design in a number of cases. The window proportions suggested exteriors designed for open conditions rather than for the narrow earth-bordered gaps that a buried position would provide. The drainage systems in some buildings were oriented for surface-level water flow rather than for the management of water in an enclosed underground space. And the quality and consistency of construction across the buried and above-ground portions of the same buildings suggested a unified design intention that did not distinguish between below-ground and above-ground spaces in the way that a builder designing a basement would typically do. None of these details individually constitute a decisive refutation of the accumulation explanation. Each one can be addressed with a response that is locally reasonable, but collectively, they form a pattern of features that points persistently in the same direction, toward lower levels that were not originally designed to be underground. That directional consistency, across multiple independent lines of physical evidence, is not easily dismissed as coincidence or as the product of selective observation. It is a real signal in the physical record of these buildings. What it means precisely, whether it reflects a misapplication of the accumulation explanation or something else entirely, is the question that the evidence raises but does not answer. The timeline question sits alongside the architectural details as an equally unresolved issue. An explanation of how ground levels changed is only as strong as the evidence for when those changes occurred. In the well-documented cases, the timeline is recoverable. The historical record confirms a period of change, describes the process that caused it, and allows the physical evidence to be interpreted against a known sequence of events. But in cases where the documentary record is absent or incomplete, the timeline is inferred rather than confirmed. And inferred timelines are vulnerable to the problem that prompted this investigation in the first place, the possibility that the standard process, applied over the expected period, would not produce the observed result at the observed scale. If the depth of burial exceeds what gradual accumulation over the available time frame would produce, then either the time frame is wrong, or the process was not gradual, or something additional was involved. Those possibilities have not been systematically examined in the locations where they are most relevant. However, the timeline does not fully match in a broader sense as well. The investigation has moved through the physical details of individual buildings, through the geographic distribution of the pattern, through the documentary record of the 19th century, and through the spectrum of interpretations offered by different researchers. At each stage, a similar structure has appeared, a mainstream explanation that is solid in its best documented cases, and a set of specific questions that the explanation does not fully resolve in cases where the documentation is thinner and the physical details are more ambiguous. The questions change form as the investigation moves through different types of evidence, but the underlying structure remains the same. An explanation with real evidentiary support leaves residual questions that have not been satisfactorily addressed. The pattern of buried entrances is real. That is established. The inconsistencies within the pattern, the features that do not fit cleanly, the locations where documentation is absent, the architectural details that suggest surface-level design rather than underground design, are also real. They are not invented or exaggerated. They are observable features of observable objects, and they persist regardless of whether any particular explanation is accepted or rejected. The absence of documentation in certain cases is real in the same way. An archive that does not contain a record of a significant urban change is a fact, even if the absence might reflect the loss of records rather than the absence of events. The fact of the absence does not prove anything, but it does mean that the explanation depends on an assumption that the records existed and were lost, that has not been independently confirmed. What those things mean together is still being debated, not loudly, in the public discussions that surround more dramatic historical controversies, but quietly, in the specific fields that have occasion to encounter this evidence: urban archaeology, architectural history, historical geography, and the informal research communities that exist outside academic institutions. The debate does not have a central forum. It does not have an agreed-upon set of questions or an organized research program directed at answering them. It happens in scattered papers, in unpublished analyses, in conversations between researchers who have noticed the same anomalies from different directions. The disagreement is real, but it is dispersed, and its dispersal means it has not yet been brought to the kind of focused, rigorous scrutiny that would move it toward resolution. Some believe that resolution is possible with more systematic research, that a comprehensive, cross-regional study of buried lower floors, examining multiple cities, analyzing the composition of fill material, establishing construction dates through independent means, and comparing documentary records across locations, would clarify which cases the accumulation explanation covers and which it does not. That kind of study has not been done. Its absence is itself a notable gap, given how long this pattern has been observed and how frequently the questions around it have been raised. Others disagree, arguing that the evidence that would be needed for such a study has been lost or degraded beyond recovery, and that the historical record can no longer be interrogated with enough precision to settle the questions being asked. That disagreement about what is even possible has not been resolved. The buildings are still there. The buried entrances are still there, in cities that have been continuously occupied for centuries, under streets that carry the traffic and commerce of the present, beneath pavements that cover the material of the past. The lower floors of old buildings sit in their buried condition, unchanged by the debate about what put them there. They do not offer interpretations. They do not argue for one explanation over another. They are simply present, physical, and specific, architectural facts that exist regardless of how they are understood, and the ground above them holds whatever answer might exist. Whether that answer is recoverable depends on whether the material filling around these lower levels has preserved enough information to be read, and on whether anyone undertakes the systematic effort required to read it. Both of those conditions are uncertain. The preservation of evidence in buried urban contexts is variable and unpredictable. The will to investigate systematically depends on resources, priorities, and the recognition that the questions being asked are worth the effort of answering rigorously. For now, the question remains open, not as an invitation to speculation, and not as a signal that the standard explanation has been overturned, but as an honest acknowledgement that the evidence examined in this investigation supports a partial explanation, that the partial explanation has identifiable and specific limits, and that those limits have not yet been addressed with the depth, rigor, and systematic attention that a genuinely complete understanding would require. The buried entrances were built to be used. Something changed, and the full account of what changed, when and why, across all the cities where this pattern appears, has not yet been written. There is something unusual about certain old buildings. Not unusual in a way that announces itself loudly. Not unusual in a way that most people notice when they walk past. But if you slow down, and if you look carefully at the lower levels of these structures, the parts that sit at or below the current ground level, you begin to notice something that quietly does not fit. There are doorways, arched openings, entrances that no longer lead anywhere. They are sealed shut, filled in with newer stonework or brick, or simply buried beneath layers of soil, pavement, and accumulated urban material. They sit there in silence, and most people never give them a second thought. What makes this worth paying attention to is not the existence of one or two such openings. Old buildings develop blocked doorways for many ordinary reasons. A wall is added. A renovation changes the layout. A door is no longer needed and is filled in. That kind of thing happens regularly and does not require much explanation. But this is something different. This is not isolated. This is not the result of a single building owner deciding to block an old entrance. This pattern appears in cities across different countries, across different continents, across entirely different architectural traditions. The same basic feature, a lower-level opening that no longer connects to the surface, appears with a frequency that begins to feel less like coincidence and more like something worth examining. The pattern repeats more often than most people realize. You find it in older European cities, where the streets are narrow and the buildings are centuries old. You find it in cities that were built up rapidly during the 18th and 19th centuries. You find it in places where the architectural record is well preserved and carefully studied. And you find it equally in places where much of the historical documentation is incomplete or missing. It crosses cultural and geographical lines in a way that makes it harder to dismiss as a purely regional phenomenon. Once you begin to look for it, the question stops being whether this exists and starts being why it exists so consistently. The first and most basic question is this: why would an entrance be buried? That question sounds simple, but it resists a simple answer. Entrances are not built by accident. They are deliberate features. They require planning, material, labor, and design. Someone decided where to place that opening, how tall to make it, how wide, how to finish the surrounding stonework. Entrances are built because they are meant to be used. They connect the inside of a structure to the outside world. They are one of the most fundamental elements of any building. So when an entrance disappears underground, when it is no longer accessible, no longer visible at surface level, no longer connected to the street, it raises a question that sits quietly without a fully satisfying answer. Consider the investment involved. These are not small gaps or narrow slits in a wall. Some of the buried openings found in older structures are substantial. They are arched doorways with careful stonework around them, proportioned in a way that suggests they were designed for regular, everyday use by people moving in and out of a building as part of normal life. The arches are finished. The surrounding masonry is worked with attention. The dimensions suggest these were primary access points, not secondary ones, not service entrances, not maintenance openings. They were built to be used by people as the main way in and out of a structure, and they were built to look that way. And yet buried they are. Some of these openings sit several feet below the modern street level. Not a few inches, not a shallow gap that could result from a single repaving project. Several feet. In some locations, the buried entrances are only partially visible. The upper portion of an arch still peaks above the current pavement line, while everything below it has disappeared under the ground. In other cases, the openings have been completely covered and would be entirely invisible if not for careful observation of the building's proportions, or for accidental discovery during construction and renovation work. That last point is worth pausing on. A number of these buried lower levels have only come to attention because someone was digging for a different reason entirely. A utility line being installed, a foundation being reinforced, a basement being expanded, and then a wall is broken through, or a floor is excavated, and there's a room, or a corridor, or an arched doorway that was not on any plan, not referenced in any record, simply sitting there beneath the current surface of a city that had moved on without it. The discovery is usually treated as a curiosity, a footnote, something interesting but not particularly significant. And then the work continues, and the opening is often sealed again. What happened to the ground level? That is the question that sits at the center of this. If these entrances were built to be used, and if they were clearly designed to connect to an outdoor space, then at some point the outdoor space was at the same level as the entrance. That is simply how buildings work. A doorway is placed at a level that allows people to step through it comfortably from the outside. You do not build an entrance several feet above or below the surface you intend people to walk on. The entrance and the ground must have been at the same level at some point, which means the ground changed. Something caused the area around these buildings to sit at a different elevation than it once did. The standard explanation for this is urban accumulation. Cities, over long periods of time, gradually rise. Streets are repaved and the new surface sits slightly higher than the old one. Debris accumulates. Old structures collapse and new ones are built on top of the rubble. Drainage projects add fill material. Slowly, over decades and centuries, the ground level creeps upward. This process is documented and accepted in historical and archaeological research. It is not a theoretical idea. Rome is one of the most frequently cited examples. The modern city sits meters above the ancient one, and excavations reveal layer after layer of accumulated urban history. Istanbul shows similar patterns. Edinburgh's Old Town has well-documented histories of rising street levels. so the explanation exists. It is established. Most historians and architects who encounter these buried lower floors point directly to this process and consider the matter largely settled. At first, that seems like a reasonable conclusion. The ground rose. The entrances were buried. The buildings continued to be used from the higher level. That is the accepted version, and for many individual cases, it likely holds. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the explanation, while real and documented in specific well-studied locations, is applied very broadly, sometimes to situations where the supporting documentation is thin or absent. If a city's ground level rose significantly over a period of time, there should be some record of that process. Engineering decisions would have been made. Property records would reflect changes. Maps from different periods would show gradual shifts. In the well-documented cases, that evidence exists. But in a surprising number of locations where buried entrances appear, that level of documentation is not there. The rise in ground level is inferred from the physical evidence of the buried architecture itself, rather than confirmed through independent historical records. That is a subtle but important distinction. There is also a question about scale that the standard explanation does not always address directly. Gradual urban accumulation over centuries can account for modest rises in street level, enough to bury the base of a wall, or to cover a lower step. But in some locations, the buried entrances sit not just slightly below the modern surface, but several feet down. That kind of elevation difference requires a substantial amount of material to have been deposited in the area around the building. And if that material was deposited gradually, over a very long period, the process should have left traces in records, in maps, in the visible layering of the building's exterior. In some cases, those traces are present. In others, they are not. The depth of burial in certain cases is difficult to account for through slow, gradual accumulation alone, without some additional explanation for where all that material came from and when it arrived.